Okay, Michael, thanks very much for doing this. We really appreciate it. Michael Keith is both an old and very warm friend of mine personally, but also an extraordinary figure in the thinking about and indeed the practice of the remaking of at least part of London, namely the East End, the area called Tower Hamlets, just east of the City of London, the financial district, that area in which Brick Lane is located, long-standing space of the rag trade, and remade over the past century and a half in terms of various migrations and immigrations into and out of the area. Michael, I think, as I've mentioned, ran the City Council of Tower Hamlets for a number of years, 5 or 6 years, a little earlier this century, and he's been a professor of sociology and urban studies at Goldsmiths, and maybe, I don't know whether he yet is, but maybe moving to Oxford. For anybody who is interested in issues of race and governmentality, particularly in relation to Britain, you would have to read Race, Riots and Policing, Law, L-O-R-E, and Order in a Multi-Racist Society. And anybody interested in the city, in global terms, his more recent book, After the Cosmopolitan, is likewise a must-read as well. It's a great pleasure to have him here with us for about an hour today across the ocean. He will talk for about 25 minutes or half an hour, and then Kate will run a Q&A with him. Michael, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks again, David. I guess in the spirit of Alcoholics Anonymous, I should say, as David pointed out, I am a recovering politician of sorts. I was for 12 years an elected member in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, and for about 11 of those 12 years, either the leader of the council or the leader of something that was called the regeneration programme of that part of East London. And for 6 years, from 2000 to 2006, I was a chair of something called the Thames Gateway Partnership. And I guess that David has asked me to talk a little bit about the cultural industries and the delivery of cultural industries programs and the realization of cultural industries in East London over the last decade or so. And I guess the most important thing I want to emphasize is the context in which everything I'm saying is taking place, which is a context where both a micro and a macro scale, the restructuring of land use, economic infrastructure, and the social configuration of that part of London has been proceeding at an incredible pace subsequent to the fairly catastrophic decline in industrial employment in the second half of the 20th century, industrial employment related largely to the old docks, but also to the fact that East London was, for many years, the second largest concentration of manufacturing in the United Kingdom, and saw a deindustrialization akin to many other cities of a kind of first, second wave industrial revolution. And so what happened, I guess, over the 90s and 2000s was a transformation that partly driven by issues of gentrification, but also driven by new forms of economic development, tied most emblematically, I guess, to the project to transform London's old docklands, to pacify by cappuccino residentially places like Wapping. Once the site where Alf Garnett, the kind of English forerunner of Archie Bunker, used to live, kind of sort of site of nationalism, of far right activity in many ways, now the place where the second homes of film stars such as Helen Mirren and old superannuated rock stars such as Cher and Rod Stewart have their riverside apartments, but also the financial services, the new financial services district of London in Canary Wharf. So the scale of change over the last 15 years is enormous, and if I think Noel Coward said that I don't know what London is coming to, the higher the buildings, the lower morals. And there's a sort of sense in which what has been up for grabs over that last 15 years is a debate about what role culture generically, let alone the cultural industries, will play in the reinvention of the metropolis. So if we ask in whose image this city is to be remade, part and parcel of the context is one of incredibly rapid change, which itself ties to a commensurable set of social traumas tied in part to the identity lexicon of race, of class, of faith, of sexuality, but also to kind of acute forms of intolerance, as well as simultaneously great moments of solidarity and cultural translation. And just to give one example, I guess, most obviously, though surprisingly for some people, between 1990 and 2005, that part of London was bombed 7 times, 4 times by the IRA, once by a far-right nail bomber, David Copeland, who chose to bomb, if you like, the iconic sites of multicultural London in Brixton, then in Brick Lane, and then on his way to Chinatown stopped in the gay village in Soho and blew up a pub horrifically there. But then more recently, on the 7th of July 2005, 7/7, one of the bombs was in Tower Hamlets, and 2 weeks later, another bomb that failed to go off took off the roof of a bus on Hackney Road. So those kind of symbols of cultural conflict are part of the historical backdrop to the development of both a new city and the role of cultural provision, as well as the cultural industries within that new city. And so I guess part of what I want to say is that in a political language, when we're talking about the cultural industries, there is, I would suggest, a sort of sense of the true lies of politics. That there has been a time at various moments in the early 1990s, in particular, I guess, where it was possible to use the language, the rhetoric, and the arguments around cultural industries to demand new resources for forms of employment, for forms of intervention in the East End that were pragmatically helpful. And there is a sense in which, if you like, there's almost a mirror dance of policy formation by which the categories of policy become inhabited cynically, pragmatically, in a principled way, but by languages that fit a particular moment. So part of the point I'd want to make is that there is always, if you like, the forked tongue of politics speaking. There is the pragmatics of trying to lever in forms of state aid programs to achieve many results, but simultaneously a set of developments, really, I guess, from the early 1990s through to the present day, where the cultural industries becomes increasingly a focus of forms of state intervention, as well as a descriptive category capturing new forms of employment. And I suppose it's at that point I should again kind of declare my interest as not necessarily quite a true believer in the work of Richard Florida, in the sense that whilst pragmatically, I suppose, to kind of shortcut large swathes of literature and an audience that is far more knowledgeable about many of these issues than myself, I would say that if we are to think about descriptively about the forms of economic change that are covered by the label of the cultural industries, we need to think carefully when the category describes what I'll come back to in the Thames Gateway the example of the first survey of the cultural industries in the Gateway, which took place in the mid-1990s, where the categories put together included forms of economic activity that range from the squatting artist to Rupert Murdoch's headquarters of print at News International in Wapping and headquarters of journalism in Canary Wharf. So when we're talking about a category that expands so chaotically, I think we need to be careful about the sorts of economic argument that we're making, the claims that are being made in the name of cultural industries. That said, I do think it is possible, notwithstanding some of the cheerleading that has emerged from both right and left, and I'll come back to this, but that it is possible to recognize that there has been an increasingly culturally inflected sense of value added across a wide range of economic activity that in one sense both commodifies the cultural, but in another sense uses culture to add value. One of the examples which I quite often kind of talk to friends about is if you go in the Austrian city of Linz, where industrial decline was met with extraordinary state-aided investment in refixing a local economy that is largely based on petrochemicals and heavy industrial work, but where the focus in Linz was increasingly on design, on computer-aided modes of contributing value added to old processes, and transformed Linz in the early 1990s into the city with the highest per capita income in Europe. And whether the kinds of new economy, the kinds of new production that emerged in a site such as Linz could be captured by the term cultural industries or not, I'm not sure. But the point is that the increasingly culturally inflected nature of the labour process was one in which some fairly important changes, I guess, were going on. And so that the sorts of new forms of employment that I think are sometimes described in this kind of catch-all notion of cultural industries need to be taken apart step by step in the labour process. I think in that context, what I would like to do is just talk a little bit about some specific examples of things that happened in the East End over the last 5-10 years, where we tried, I guess, using the true lies of the political, recognizing the chaotic conceptualization of the term itself, but strategically trying to think about the potential of the cultural industries to contribute to a debate about regeneration, to make a difference. Precisely because the point, I suppose, that is at the heart of this is both a political ambivalence and an intellectual uncertainty about both the vocabulary of the cultural industries industry, but also a degree of faith, of belief in the potential of the cultural industries to contribute productively in reshaping the city. At times, the point I'm trying to make is that in the big debates about making a new East End or creating this slightly hubristic notion of the Thames Gateway, which some journalists have described as either Prescottgrad or a Cockney Siberia. It's meant to be a new city to the east of London, almost the size of Leeds, about 700 to 800,000 people added to the population of that part of London over the next 10 to 15 years. A project which is, as I say, hubristic in many ways, that part of the debate, both at the micro level of the borough of Tower Hamlets or the macro level of the Thames Gateway sub-region, part of the argument has always been about whether issues of city transformation should be led by property development, Lego, maps, planners, utopian visions of the future, or something that tries to at least recognize the cultural dynamics, the flows, the the settlement of the social and ethical worlds that will inhabit the buildings. And some of the cultural industries debates, I think, are productive in that sense, while simultaneously recognizing the potential of new forms of industry, new forms of employment. There are three examples I want to just touch on in the time I have remaining to me. The first of these relates to an organization known as the Cultural Industries Development Agency, which I was involved with setting up in the early 1990s. The second with the Gateway itself, and the third with issues that tie into Banglatown on a project known as the Rich Mix Cultural Foundation. I think on the first of these, in the early 1990s, there was a sense in which there was, from a political position of the left, whatever that term means these days, but certainly which the geometry of which I think was clear at the time, there was a deep suspicion of both the scale of gentrification that had been seen in adjacent boroughs, a recognition of the, if you like, the forces at work economically, but also a sense in which some of the debates around economic change locally began to focus in on the presence of a very large number of artists in the East End of London, but also in the connected professions of, I guess, particular kind of design, the growing numbers of web-related practices that were tied into that artistic employment base. Again, by some slightly grandiose measures, the East End actually had, by the early 1990s, the highest concentration of practicing artists in Europe, in the boroughs of Hackney and Tower Hamlets combined. But also a form of activity that unexpectedly was almost most vulnerable, both to forms of gentrification, but also forms of planning-led rezoning of the city. Most obviously, old factory spaces that were zoned for employment uses could be occupied legally or informally by artists quite happily, but what would frequently happen was, and there are a number of rag trade owners who've explained this to me in detail, that if under British law, if your building is zoned for employment use, you make sure that you put a big sign up outside saying working space to rent. And then you make sure that whenever anyone tries to ring you up to try and rent that space, you stay away from the phone, you don't answer them, and by the time you have failed to let your space for 12 months, you're then legally able to challenge the zoning regulations and say, for example, in the case of the rapidly declining rag trade over the last 10 years, that there is no profitable use because no one will rent your property as an employment base, and so therefore you'd rather change it to the higher value zoning of residential. So increasingly, part of the debate around gentrification has been a debate about land use zoning, but it's one where the high concentration of artists were increasingly displaced by the rezoning of warehouses and old industrial buildings. And so as part of the attempt to try and preserve some of that economic base, we set up something called the Cultural Industries Development Agency and tied it into various forms of state aid tied to economic regeneration funding, which was, I guess, in itself significant, had particular successes. There was a program that started in Hackney tied to a very creative individual, a woman called Dinika Ferguson, called Hidden Art, that produced, if you like, a curation of that artistic activity that almost cemented its place in some protected workspaces, but also through the, if you like, the synergies between some of those economic goods and the gentrification, the property pornography of the 1990s booms led to related craft type employment that broadly was covered by the bracket of the creatives or the cultural industries, particularly around custom-made furniture design tied to the residential market and so on. So that, if you like, there were simultaneously both tensions tensions between the force of gentrification and displacement of economic activity, and the emergence of a new design sector tied precisely to that disposable income linked to the gentrification itself. A kind of tension that in some ways is incommensurable, but also challenges the function of the state agency, the Cultural Industries Development Agency, over time. And as the rhetorics move on, part of the debate, as the Cultural Industries Development Agency carries on today, is about exactly what purpose that agency should fulfill, and how, if you like, you sit in the kind of mimesis I was talking about before, in a position where you have an agency that relates to a way of thinking about regeneration itself. The second example I want to talk about a little bit, I guess, ties into the Thames Gateway more generally. And although I don't have time to develop this at great length, that when the debates have taken place about exactly what kind of city should be emerging to the east of London, part of the debate always comes round to a discussion about the potential of the cultural industries to offer alternative sources of employment to the principal forms of economic opportunity that still sit to the east of London, which are a residual manufacturing base, but also on top of that, the new financial services sector in Canary Wharf, which has seen something like 80% of the property-led development in London as a whole from 1998 to 2003 took place in Canary Wharf and on the city fringe in the one borough of Tower Hamlets. But and so part of the problem with some of the regeneration debates have been, is it all about Canary Wharf or nothing? And so there's a kind of almost a case to be made on the part of the cultural industries in that context. And in shaping the gateway as a whole, one of the things that was frequently discussed was the possibility of creating, if you like, as both a state artifact, but as a product of forms of state intervention, cultural industries clusters. And although I wouldn't want to go into too much detail about this, given the time I've got, I think again there's a tension there between both recognizing something quite productive in new forms of economic activity, but also a tension between trying to think about this new city and a notion of cultural provision, the basic kind of forms of cinema, theatre, subsidized arts production that might be commensurable with the ambition or the rhetoric of the new city, in particular tied more recently to the thing that got latched onto the gateway, the Olympics bit. And you see, and particularly on Saturday, we'll hear a great deal about how London won't match Beijing for spectacle, but it will outdo Beijing for legacy. The legacy rhetoric is at the heart of both the bid of London for the Olympics pre the award, but also the legitimation strategies that are tied to the defence of public expenditure on the Olympics subsequent to the award. And those themselves depend upon a notion of the good city that might emerge as part of the gateway. And as part of that good city, the role of cultural provision more broadly begins to blur with the debate about cultural industries itself. And I guess the third and final example I'd want to give ties into the area of that David mentioned earlier on, which is Banglatown. Banglatown was renamed as part of the regeneration strategy in the borough in the 1990s, sometimes to the great offence of people from both left and right. But it also, I guess, exemplifies part of what I was trying to talk about earlier on about a knowing sense of the problems with the descriptor, if you like. Banglatown was used, I think, quite cleverly by some, particularly Bangladeshi activists, some of whom came from economically from an old CP background, where faced with the steady march eastwards of the City of London and the fear that, if you like, the concrete towers of the square mile the financial district of East London would kind of overrun the old East End linked to Brick Lane in particular, but the surrounding areas to Brick Lane. Banglatown was almost invented as a way of solidifying many different and contradictory interests that might preserve that area as both a place to live and a place to work. It was something that caused a degree of controversy, not least because the Bangladeshi migration to that area is only the latest, as people will know, of kind of many waves of different forms of the articulation of London's answer to Ellis Island. So the fear was always that the changing same is tied to a kind of ossified authenticity, I guess. But that said, the knowing power of the label of Banglatown was ratified in forms of funding, reified in forms of signposts, an arch kind of mimicking the Chinatown Arch in the centre of London, the forms of, if you like, curated culture that promoted tourism on a fairly successful scale over the years, which does provide both, if you like, a strategic response to some forms of development pressures, as well as a form of cultural curation which is successful in some respects but problematic in others, I guess. And Halima Begum, a feminist Bangladeshi critic, has been fairly stringent about the sorts of cultural performance that are sanctioned and that are deemed illegitimate within Brick Lane itself and the surrounding area. So I suppose seen at its most unfortunate at the moment when Monica Ali's book was burnt by a very small minority of people to great publicity, and when some of the attempts to film that book were objected to fairly vociferously by really a handful of people. Although what attracted less publicity was that there were a larger number of people who wished to kind of stand in as extras for the film when it was eventually made than stood up in the politics of the demos. But alongside that, if you like, spatial definition of the ethnic enclave, there's also been an attempt to put together what was known initially as a museum without artifacts, which is the Rich Mix Cultural Foundation today, which on the site of the old Jago, my preferred name for the arts centre itself was Yago, which is means wake up, get up in Bengali. But also kind of, if you like, echoes the Jago, the old Victorian settlement in that area. But it is an arts centre that has eventually opened this year with about £28 million of state funding, which is intending, at least, to combine the potential of the cultural industries to generate employment with the facility of culture to engage in dialogue. So it combines cinematic practice, arts curation, theatre, alongside sheltered and subsidized workspaces for startups in the creatives. And I guess what I would say about the Rich Mix Centre, which I've been director of, I guess, for 14 years or so, is that it is both again, something that has its own contradictions. It is dependent on state subsidy. It generates particular kinds of controversy about the forms of culture that might be curated there. When there was a proposal to put a cinema up, it was objected to initially by some of the voices from the mosque who suggested that the representational politics of cinema would be considered unacceptable locally. But it is at the same time, I guess, a site where at least culture can be contested. And in the words of Wahid Ali, Lord Wahid Ali is one of the board members of Rich Mix, there might be a need in the shadow of the events of 7/7 and the forms of some forms of articulation of faith-based politics to find a cultural alternative to the mosque, which itself draws on the cultural industries. The point I try and make in conclusion, just to wrap up, I guess, is that in each of these examples, and in most of the work with the cultural industries in the East End, there is both a sense of ambivalence alongside a sense of hope in both the political potential of the cultural industries to deliver locally progressive outcomes, but also the economic value of the terms themselves being both contested, contingent, but also capturing some of the realities, both in the call for further state subsidy of certain activity that I believe is worthy, but also the description of some forms of new economic growth that do offer some opportunities at a local level. I hope that gives some sense of the area. Is that okay, David? Does that give an introduction to?
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Hi.
Hi, it's Kate over here. Hi, sorry. No,
Did you not hear any of that?
No, we heard all of it. You just couldn't hear me.
All right.
You were being very competent.
I thought I was probably just chatting away. So I thought David might have an empty room there, so he kind of that's why he didn't put the.
No, not at all. No, not at all. No, I know this is like you being in the Big Brother house because we can see you and you can't see us. But thank you very much for that. That was really great. And we're just going to have a bit of we're going to have clapping now.
All right.
Which I hope you can hear.
It's not canned.
It's all taking place in a Hollywood studio.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Yeah, don't worry.
Have we got some questions? And given that Michael can't see anyone, can you give your name when you ask a question, just so you'll seem a bit less anonymous? Is that possible? Okay.
Hi, my name is Paula Chakravarti, and thank you for a very interesting talk. I had a question just about the last site that you talked about, Banglatown, and I wondered, you gave the specific examples where you showed the kind of, the strange bedfellows between left and right, activists creating this contested cultural space. I wonder if you could give a little bit more. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what you meant in terms of the sedimentation of, or the ossification of a kind of culture, Bangladeshi migrants in relation to what existed there before? I mean, are there contests over community and space there, not just left and right within the Bangladeshi community?
Absolutely. As I say, I think what is always fascinating about, for me, about that particular space are the stories that cut against the expected, that make the space unhomely, that unsettle our judgments. And so some of the stories you don't hear about Brick Lane are about the fact that there is a transvestite dance club, a Bangladeshi transvestite dance club just off Brick Lane, but that never gets a mention. There are all sorts of activity that exists within this space that are about, if you like, both haunted pasts and uncertain futures in a very kind of heterogeneous present. So some of the community politics of that area mimics some of the debates locally, whereby, as you will know, I mean, the struggle for a Bangladeshi nation was itself, in part, a debate about a secular nationalist alternative to the original Pakistan that produced clashes between Jamati politics and what has become Awami League, or the politics that followed Bangabandhu, Mujib Rahman, and created a very strong secular left in diasporic form locally. But also, when Mujib came to power, Jamaat were initially banned, but also the Razakars, the people who had sided with the Pakistan army when going in to suppress the nationalist struggle, were forced out of Bangladesh, and like lots of diasporic communities across time, came to London. So there's a reenactment of some of the politics around, which has become inflected very differently now between a new form of Islamism that ties into Muslim Brotherhood, that ties into Jamaat, that ties into some mosques, and a strong strand of Awami League politics that emphasizes something much more secular. But both inside that whilst that contest is articulated in some ways, there are forms of behaviour that are deemed acceptable on Brick Lane, Banglatown, that are, if you like, policed by different legitimate community elders. So that one of the points that Halima makes, and in a project that we carried out a number of years ago, working with young people of many different backgrounds, one of the things you would often hear young Bangladeshi women saying was that they preferred the areas that were ostensibly all white, caricatured as the more racist parts of town, precisely because if they were young women hanging out on the streets of Brick Lane, the forms of community surveillance were such that they, again, predictably, it involved a certain kind of policing of the body, of what was acceptable, that was, if you like, not seen in, paradoxically, the kind of white areas known for their intolerance, but also bizarrely more free to exercise certain kinds of everyday life. So yeah, I mean, it's a highly contested area, both internal to Bangladeshi community politics as well as in the terms of how that the politics of recognition that has now described that space as Banglatown is itself something that inverts what began as an insult. Banglatown was originally an insult from the far right, when people talked about it as a term of abuse, and that there is a kind of conscious reappropriation of that term of abuse, that it has been part of that history. But sorry, that's probably too long an answer to the question.
No, that was great. Thanks very much. Question?
Okay, all right. Yeah, and thanks again for your presentation. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the presence of mega real estate corporations in the East End, and also the campaigns against them. And I'm thinking specifically of Hammerson and their involvement in the redevelopment of the Spitalfields market, and they're also part of this scheme to basically extend the city square mile further east into Shoreditch. And I'm also thinking of the what's been happening around Queen's Market in Newham. And I'm wondering what you think about the activities of these corporations and the campaigns against them. And I guess what I'm wondering is if these campaigns reflect a kind of larger public disillusionment that, a continually expanding, kind of overheated real estate market benefits everyone.
Yes and yes, but I mean, I think there is there's a book that I'm sure you've read by Jane M. Jacobs, called Edge of Empire, which is quite old now, but it describes, I guess it was published in mid-90s, about 94, 95, and part of it is her doctoral work, which describes one of the campaigns, the campaign to save Spitalfields. And I guess there is a straightforward sense in which the point I was trying to make about the future of this city is that what's at stake is a debate about in whose image this city will be made, and if that image is purely in the interests of capital, then it becomes a certain kind of predictable urban form and a certain kind of milieu, as well as a social settlement that is politically not one that I would either wish to identify with or wish to promote. It does, however, I think, begin to challenge. The point I'm trying to make is that there is a challenge to the left, as well as a challenge to the right, about exactly what kind of politics can be produced productively in the face of the logic of capital, in epitomized by whether it's Hammerson's or by some of the micro developments that have similar goals or similar ends at least. And I think in that sense, Jane has a quite nice phrase where she talks about one of the interesting things for her being that the white left in the area were always disappointed by the vicarious failures of the Bangladeshi community to become, if you like, the heroic actors in some of this. And I think there is a sense in which, and I wouldn't want to kind of characterize this too crudely, but there is a sense in which some of the campaigns against development are easy to fight for those people whose investment locally is either that of the gentrifiers, who become, you know, the authentic East Enders very quickly when faced with an office building out the back door, or the people who are passing through. Whereas some of the points about the Banglatown initiative, which she describes quite well, I think, in her book, was that some of the interests were, crudely put, petty bourgeois. They involved compromises made. They involved, if you like, a commodification of culture, the culture of Brick Lane itself, a kind of curation and exhibition and presentation of ethnicity to a market that sold itself in the face of that property, those property-based interests, and we're prepared to do deals with them. And so, I suppose what I have a problem sometimes with is the kind of characterization of the campaigns against, whether it's in the Newham case or whether it's in the case of the Spitalfields campaigns, of a kind of Manichaean universe. Because when you look, certainly when I look around, without naming names, some of the individuals who are most vociferous, both white and Bengali, of 10, 15 years ago, are the ones who've cashed in, and a number of interests who will kind of buy a ransom strip as part of their campaign and then sell it on very large sums of money 5, 10 years later is remarkable. And I think from a left point of view, which I would identify with, there's an obligation to try and think about the sorts of strategic alternatives that might produce an economic analysis of the left, which recognizes the interests of capital and the interests of Hammerson's or any others, and tries to think about what kinds of engagement there might be. And I think, I mean, there is a longer debate about individual buildings and individual sites, but I think the ethos ought to be one in which we think productively about how we use land zoning, how we use campaigning politics, and how we use the ways in which you can use the techniques of law and political campaigning to deliver for the local community rather than for the headlines. But that may be a kind of jaundiced old politician's answer, I guess.
Thank you very much, Juan.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for that presentation, and thank you especially for providing such an excellent meso example of how high policy meets on-the-ground politics in East London. I want to ask you a question that might be relevant to the whole case of East London, or might be more precisely answer in connection with Banglatown. You presented a spectrum of political possibilities, and my question is political. The spectrum going from ossified authenticity and the codified performance of ethnicity to culture as a contested live terrain. And the question, it moves towards this second pole of the spectrum. If you want to keep Banglatown or East London as live culture, as contested culture where issues of redistribution and inequality can be raised, there are two things that occur to me are important politically that I would like you to address if possible. One is, what was the political representation of the different interest involved in, say, Banglatown or the redevelopment of East London? And by political representation, I mean not simply voice, but I mean vote and capacity to change and have agency there. That's one. So what was the political representation of the different parties involved? And secondly, if there is any board or advisory board or agency that is in charge of keeping the contested live nature of Banglatown, for example, alive, that is to say that functions to resolve issues of conflicts of power and conflicts of interest that may arise out of that was created when common resources, public resources, were spent in redevelopment. Does it make sense?
The first, it does make sense, and I'm trying to find an answer that's not 3 books long, as it were. But the most straightforward answer to the first question is that that there is now an electoral ward of Spitalfields and Banglatown that is represented now by 3 Bangladeshi councillors, has been mostly 2 two Bangladeshi, one white for the last 15 years. And that forms one of 17 wards in the borough that, of the 50-odd councillors, the Labour Party that I led, I mean, there is a longer, and for me at least, an interesting story about the extraordinarily successful Bangladeshi political machine that won power really in the mid-1990s. That effectively some of my friends, some of the people who are still friends of mine, were part of that machine, and that machine had all of the advantages and I think all of the disadvantages of most political machines that people will be familiar with in the States, I guess, but achieved a position where in the Labour group, which at various times over the last 10, 12 years has held somewhere between 26 seats on that council and 40, the majority of councillors are Bangladeshi and have been for some while. So in terms of ethnicity, the majority of the majority representation, the voice is Bangladeshi. But of course, this does not translate or correspond with interests straightforwardly, as we know from all the problems of representative politics, and its participatory dimensions are highly contested, frequently contradictory, and challenged from all sorts of different quarters. So most obviously there is a strong voice of the restaurant sector in that area, which has its own version of who are the guardians of Bangladeshi culture in Banglatown, alongside a strong voice for the mosque, which represents a form of Islamic practice which is highly distinctive and consciously opposed to the more Wahhabi influenced forms of practice at East London Mosque, 500 yards to half a mile away. And so alongside that, there's been for many years in that part of London an informal economy that is multicultural, multiracial, in which voices that are Bangladeshi are complicit, and voices that are many different ethnicities are complicit, and ties into drugs, ties into crime, ties into protection rackets, ties into some of the more interesting stories about Banglatown. So that one of the more famous restaurateurs, who was Pakistani rather than Bangladeshi, spent large amounts of his time at Her Majesty's pleasure, not least on one occasion when he was running 3 restaurants from the mains electricity that tied into the lights, the street lights. And so there is a very kind of complex politics of community participatory action and mobilization. And as ever, some voices are heard more than others, and that contest is, a product of its staging, as well as a microcosm of formal electoral politics locally. And so, at that micro level, it's a kind of an ongoing soap opera of strong ethical dimensions and sometimes admirable and sometimes less admirable ethical outcomes, I guess. But the point I guess I'd want to make a little bit about East London more generally is that we are now, I guess, at a moment where certain kinds of multicultural harmony discourse is the received wisdom, is the norm, is the kind of the jam that covers up all the issues that I think you're alluding to around recognition, around entrenched forms of institutional racism, around forms of reproduced and systemic injustice, so that it becomes very easy to have a London Olympics bid which is not just premised on but focused upon a kind of multicultural feel-good rhetoric of cosmopolitan London, and was good enough to beat Paris, I guess, but itself appeals to a certain kind of rhetoric of the cosmopolitan city that I think masks as much as it reveals. But hopefully that provides a bit of an answer to that.
Okay. Anyone else? Can I get I'll get a question. It's Kate Oakley here.
Yeah.
We've been talking a lot this week about notions of the precariat and precarious labour. and about
Yeah.
whether the notion makes any sense at a kind of global level, whether we're talking about precarious labour in the global south and the global north, and particularly the way in which the cultural industries sort of play into this. The notion, I think, in policy terms in the north, that this is good work and this is desirable work. And it's one of the things that strikes me as interesting is that while in academic work this is attracting increasing attention, it remains, in policy terms, a total blind spot.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you reflected on that issue of, in a sense, the kind of work that we do in encouraging the growth of kind of precarious employment, to put it crudely.
You see, I think that I think that's an incredibly interesting question, but it comes back to the chaotically conceived nature of the cultural industries more generally, so that there are certain sectors of economic activity that are generally would be regarded as almost emblematically tied to the cultural industries, particularly around web design and the new, if you like, web-linked sources of employment that have high cultural elements to them. I mean, also linking into the kind of growth of architecture and related professions that tie into the construction industries, where, if you like, the portfolio career is highly remunerated, highly insecure, and where, if you like, the kind of Richard Sennett-like sense of identity may be sometimes missing, but the cash is quite good work in return for that instability. But there are, if that represents, if you like, one sector of the global cultural industries, there are many others where that the forms of labour practice are pretty poor, where the remuneration is extraordinarily low, where the dependence on new forms of migrant labour are increasingly diverse. So it is more and more common to find in the Bangladeshi restaurants, certainly the more upmarket ones close to Brick Lane, if not so much the ones on Brick Lane itself, that the people serving behind the bars and working on the tables are Polish, are Lithuanian, are if you like, the new A8 migrants, as well as Bangladeshi migrants, and where the forms of employment in some of those areas are historically and in the present day pretty precarious in the way you're suggesting. So I think the point I was trying to make earlier on is, I think if you think in terms of it sounds a bit kind of tanky 1970s almost, but if you think in terms of labour process, the cultural industries actually correspond to a wide range of very different employment practices and economic activity, and I think within those labour processes you find definitions of both, if you like, those forms of precarious life alongside forms of fairly kind of rapid social mobility, I think. So there's a contradictory nature in the I would suggest in the form. Great,
thank you very much.
Is
I'd just like to thank you again for being our first guinea pig on being telecommuted in this way, and I think everyone's got a lot out of it. Thanks very much, and go off and have dinner.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope it was helpful.